England, winter 1943. The airfield at RAF Leiston lies half hidden beneath a blanket of fog. It is cold enough for the mechanic's breath to hang in the air like smoke from the distant hangars. The tarmac glistens with rain. Beneath a tarpaulin sits a strange aircraft, familiar in shape yet subtly different. Its polished aluminum skin gleams dully under the overcast sky. A crew of ground engineers stands around it in silence, gloved hands in their pockets, watching as one man signals the test pilot to start the engine. A few feet away, an American engineer, eyes tired from months of redesign, coat stained with oil, presses a pencil to his notebook, tracing the last adjustments. The name stenciled on the fuselage reads, P-51 Mustang, Merlin prototype. The propeller begins to turn slowly, the cough of the ignition barely audible over the wind. Then the engine catches, a sharper, deeper growl, not the thin whine of the older Allison version. A column of white exhaust curls through the cold air. The man lowers his pencil and looks up. For the first time, the Mustang does not sound like a light fighter. It sounds predatory. Across the runway, pilots emerge from the ready room to watch. They have heard rumors of this experiment, a machine combining American design with British power. None expect much. The first Mustangs, though sleek, had failed at altitude, fast but strangled by thin air. Now the engine note deepens, confident and menacing. The pilot gives a thumbs up. The engineer nods. The aircraft rolls forward, wheels cutting through puddles, and lifts into the mist. For a moment there is silence, then a streak of motion overhead as the plane climbs higher and higher. One of the mechanics mutters almost to himself, "That can't be the same Mustang." The engineer says nothing. He knows what they're hearing, the sound of rejection reborn. This is the engine design they called impractical, wasteful, unproven. Now above the English countryside, it's rewriting the air war. The story of how this moment came to be began long before this flight, back when America and its allies were desperate for a fighter that could survive deep inside enemy skies. By 1942, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard of ambition. The Allied bombing campaign was in full force, but the cost was staggering. Every daylight mission deep into Germany meant dozens of B-17s and B-24s falling in flames, their crews scattered across fields and towns from Holland to Saxony. The Luftwaffe still held the advantage, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs prowling the bomber streams with precision and fury. American doctrine had promised that tight bomber formations and defensive guns could protect themselves. It was a dangerous illusion. Past the range of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, there was nothing to shield the bombers. They flew naked into the heart of Hitler's empire. Crews called it the longest hour, the stretch over central Germany when enemy fighters appeared like hawks circling a convoy of doves. The loss rates became unsustainable. Sometimes 1 in 5 planes never returned. Inside the briefing rooms of the 8th Air Force, commanders stared at maps blackened with mission markers. The truth was simple. Without a long-range escort, daylight bombing could fail before it broke the Reich's will. The British, flying at night, already relied on speed and darkness. The Americans insisted on precision, daylight, and courage, but courage could not outrun fuel limits. Every engineer on both sides of the Atlantic knew what was missing: a fighter fast enough, high-climbing enough, and enduring enough to fly to Berlin and back. But the solution was more complicated than it sounded. Engine technology was stretched to its limits. Airframes could not balance weight with endurance, and bureaucrats moved slower than the machines they managed. Yet in California, a small team at North American Aviation had begun designing something new, a low-drag airframe that promised the range the others lacked. It would soon be named the Mustang. At first, it was just another British contract fighter, a stopgap, something to satisfy London's urgent demand. No one imagined it would become the most feared aircraft over Europe. But as the air war deepened, the Mustang's quiet evolution would collide with one engineer's rejected idea, an idea that would give America the weapon it needed to win the sky. In early 1940, with Britain standing alone against the Luftwaffe, the Royal Air Force turned desperately to its American allies for help. The British Purchasing Commission approached several US manufacturers, asking for fighters to fill the gap left by Spitfire losses. North American Aviation, a young company led by the sharp and pragmatic Dutch Kindleberger, saw an opportunity. Instead of producing outdated designs under license, Kindleberger proposed something bold: to design an entirely new fighter from the ground up, one that could outperform anything currently in the sky. They promised to build it in just 120 days. It sounded impossible, yet by September of that same year, the prototype NA-73X rolled out of the California hangar. A sleek, low-slung aircraft with elegant wings and a revolutionary laminar flow design that minimized drag. It was fast, modern, and efficient, but it carried a flaw that no amount of design brilliance could fix: its engine. The Allison V-1710, though reliable and rugged, simply could not breathe at high altitudes. Above 15,000 feet, where Europe's air battles raged, the engine gasped for power. Test pilots loved the Mustang's handling, but called it half a thoroughbred. The RAF received the early P-51As and used them for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, where the Allison engine performed well. But as a high-altitude interceptor, it was hopeless. Reports from combat squadrons were polite but blunt. The Mustang had potential, but not the right heart. Back in the United States, the Army Air Forces showed little interest. The Mustang wasn't a priority. The P-47 and P-38 were already in production. The military bureaucracy had no time for another experiment. For a moment, the aircraft seemed destined to vanish quietly. A promising design that came too late, powered by an engine too weak. Yet somewhere inside those performance charts and test reports, one American engineer saw something others missed. The airframe itself was nearly perfect. What it needed was a new engine, a new idea, one that had already been dismissed as impractical. It was an idea that would soon defy the experts and change the balance of air power over Europe. The man who refused to let the Mustang die was an engineer named Edgar Schmued, a German-born designer who had become one of North American aviation's most gifted minds. Schmued had seen the devastation of the First World War firsthand and carried into his work an almost obsessive belief in engineering precision. When the Mustang was dismissed as underpowered but promising, he took it personally. He knew the airframe had unmatched aerodynamic potential, yet it was being shackled by an engine that could not rise with it. What if the answer wasn't to redesign the plane, but to give it a new heart entirely? At the time, a handful of experimental designs were circulating in engineering circles. Twin propeller layouts, radical turbocharging concepts, even hybrid superchargers. Most of them were rejected outright, too costly, too untested, or too un-American. One concept in particular, the idea of merging a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with an American airframe, was quietly laughed out of several meetings. The Merlin was Britain's prized creation, the engine that gave the Spitfire its wings. Fitting it into an American fighter seemed unnecessary and politically awkward. Yet Schmued couldn't shake the thought. He studied the Merlin's altitude performance curves compared to the Allison's and saw a simple truth: the British engine could lift the Mustang from mediocrity to dominance. When Schmued raised the idea with senior officials, it was met with skepticism. The U.S. Army Air Forces were cautious. Inter-allied cooperation in technology was a bureaucratic maze. Even inside North American aviation, some executives worried that tampering with the Mustang's engine layout could destroy its balance or delay production during wartime. "We already have the Thunderbolt," one officer argued, "and we don't need another experiment." But Schmued persisted, sketching and recalculating, convinced that the Mustang's laminar flow wing could handle the power of the Merlin and remain stable at altitude. He was right, but at that time no one was ready to listen. It would take another group of engineers across the Atlantic, working out of a small shop in Derby, England, to bring his vision to life. And when they did, it would shock both sides of the Atlantic. In 1942, as the air war intensified, British test pilots at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough began experimenting with captured and loaned aircraft. Among them sat a few American-built Mustangs, fast, graceful, but disappointing at altitude. British engineers, especially those at Rolls-Royce, couldn't ignore the airframe's potential. Beneath its American skin lay aerodynamic genius. The laminar flow wing reduced drag dramatically, and its internal fuel capacity promised greater range than any Spitfire. The problem, as they all knew, was the Allison engine. It simply ran out of breath above 15,000 feet. Rolls-Royce test engineer Ronald Harker was one of the first to suggest a bold solution. What if they installed the Merlin 61, the same supercharged engine that powered the Spitfire Mk9. Harker wrote in his report that the Mustang's airframe is possibly the best low-drag platform ever produced, and that with the Merlin, it could become the best Allied fighter of the war. It was an audacious claim, yet within months 2 Mustang airframes, serial numbers AL975 and AM121, were shipped to the Rolls-Royce facility in Hucknall for conversion. The mechanics there worked in secret, hand-fitting the British engine into the American fuselage. It was not a simple swap. The Merlin's cooling and supercharger systems required major redesigns of the cowling and intake ducts. But when they finished and the prototype finally fired to life, it was clear something extraordinary had happened. On the first test flights in late 1942, the hybrid Mustang climbed faster than any Allied aircraft then in service. It reached speeds over 440 mph and could hold altitude with ease. The pilot's log entry that day was simple but electric. "This thing climbs like a Spitfire and runs like a racer." News of the British experiment reached Washington and North American Aviation within weeks. Some American officers were skeptical, others quietly furious that the British had solved what their own bureaucracy had ignored. But as data poured in from Farnborough, disbelief gave way to amazement. The Mustang had been reborn not in a design office, but in a small British workshop, fueled by curiosity and desperation. It was no longer just a fighter, it was a transatlantic creation. The next step would bring this unlikely machine into full American production, and with it, the beginning of Germany's nightmare in the skies. When news of the British test results reached North American Aviation, the mood shifted from skepticism to urgency. The reports from Hucknall were impossible to ignore. Climb rates that rivaled the Spitfire, top speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour, and altitude performance that made the original Allison engine look obsolete overnight. Within days, telegrams and technical drawings crossed the Atlantic. The American engineers who had once dismissed the idea now scrambled to replicate it. The challenge was immense, integrating the Rolls-Royce Merlin into U.S. production standards, with Packard in Detroit licensed to build the engine under American designation, the Packard FEW 1653. The redesign began in a corner of the North American plant in Inglewood, California. Engineers tore apart existing Mustangs, cutting and reshaping the nose to fit the supercharged Merlin and its new cooling system. Every bolt, panel and duct had to be recalculated. The new radiator intake, positioned under the fuselage, wasn't just functional. It created a unique Meredith effect, using heat from the coolant to generate additional thrust. What had begun as an experimental adaptation now bordered on revolutionary. When the first Merlin-powered prototype, designated XP-51B, rolled out for testing in November 1942, expectations were cautious but curious. The airfield fell silent as the engine roared to life. The Mustang's tone was different now, deeper, hungrier. Test pilot Bob Chilton climbed into the cockpit, adjusted his oxygen mask and throttled forward. The aircraft surged down the runway, accelerating faster than any Mustang before it. Within seconds it lifted off and began an effortless climb, slicing through cloud cover like a bullet through silk. Observers on the ground exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone knew what they'd just seen. The next morning the data confirmed it. The new Mustang could reach altitudes over 40,000 feet, cruise at 430 mph, and sustain long-range flight that no Allied fighter could match. Schmued's vision, once dismissed, had been vindicated. The rejected engine concept was no longer a theory. It was now the core of the aircraft that would change the air war. Across the Atlantic, the British called it the miracle fighter. In the States, production orders multiplied overnight. The first batch of P-51B Mustangs would be shipped to England within months, just in time to meet the Luftwaffe head-on. November 30th, 1942. The test runway at Inglewood shimmered with haze as the Merlin-powered Mustang waited at the threshold. The engineers clustered near the hangar doors, notebooks in hand, their coats pulled tight against the California wind. The pilot, Bob Chilton, gave a last nod to the ground crew and pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft leapt ahead, its tires kicking dust and pebbles. The roar that followed wasn't familiar. It was sharper, cleaner, with a metallic resonance that vibrated through the airfield fences. Within seconds, the plane was airborne. Everyone craned upward as it rose into the blue, its silver wings flashing in the sunlight. In the control van, Edgar Schmued watched in silence, his hands clasped. He knew that if this test failed, months of work would vanish under bureaucratic weight. But when Chilton's voice crackled over the radio, steady, almost calm, it carried the news that no one expected. Climb rate excellent. Power smooth all the way up. At 20,000 feet, the Mustang was still pulling strongly. By 30,000, it was leaving the chase plane behind. The Merlin engine, once considered too foreign, too experimental, was singing in perfect harmony with the American airframe. The P-51B flew like it had been waiting for this engine all along. When it landed, the crowd around the strip broke their composure with rare applause. Schmued exhaled for the first time in hours. The Mustang had proven itself, and it was only the beginning. Reports soon reached Wright Field and the Army Air Force's Material Command. Numbers didn't lie. Top speed 440 mph, range over 1,000 miles with drop tanks, service ceiling beyond 40,000 feet. The data sheets read like a revelation. One colonel wrote in disbelief, "We finally have the fighter that can go anywhere the bombers go." Production orders followed almost immediately. Packard ramped up Merlin manufacturing under license, while North American engineers refined the airframe for mass output. The P-51B was born, and soon its longer-range cousin, the P-51D, would follow, with a bubble canopy and 650 caliber machine guns ready for war. On factory floors, the hum of assembly lines echoed the same rhythm as the engine that had once been rejected. Somewhere between those rivets and the roar of the Merlin, America had found its wings. By late 1943, the P-51B began arriving at RAF bases across England under the colours of both the US 8th Air Force and the Royal Air Force. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. Pilots who had flown Thunderbolts and Lightnings now stood speechless as they inspected the Mustang's sleek silhouette, the long fuselage, the low drag canopy, and that new haunting growl of the Merlin engine. The ground crews noticed it too. The moment the throttle opened, the plane didn't just move, it lunged forward like a thoroughbred impatient for release. The first operational squadrons, including the 354th Fighter Group, received their Mustangs in December. They were tasked with a mission that had broken so many before them: deep escort into Germany, guarding the bomber streams over Bremen, Hamburg, and eventually Berlin itself. The pilots were skeptical. They had heard big promises before, but on their first runs, those promises turned to shock. The Mustang could climb faster than the German Bf 109, dive away from the FW 190, and still have fuel left after crossing the Rhine. For the first time, American bombers were not alone. From 25,000 feet, the Luftwaffe's interceptors spotted the strange silver fighters at the edges of formation, machines that didn't turn back when the bombers reached enemy airspace. The Germans assumed they must be a new Spitfire variant, but their shape and speed told a different story. These aircraft stayed with the bombers all the way in, all the way out, fighting every step of the journey. Reports from returning bomber crews were almost incredulous. "They never left us," one B-17 gunner wrote. "They chased the Focke-Wulfs off our tails over Hanover and were still overhead when we hit the channel." Even the hardened veterans of the 8th Air Force could sense it. The war in the air was shifting. German commanders began noticing too. The Allied formations that once limped home now returned in strength. For the first time, the Reich's industrial heartlands were within sustained Allied reach. The P-51B, born from rejection, had become the key that unlocked the last door of German airspace. But its arrival also marked the beginning of something the Luftwaffe had never faced before, a machine that could outfight and outrun them on their own terms. In the winter of 1944, the skies over Europe began to tell a different story. Once ruled by the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, they were now streaked with the contrails of silver Mustangs, escorting endless waves of American bombers. The 8th Air Force had grown into an unstoppable armada, hundreds of flying fortresses and liberators soaring toward Germany each morning, their flanks guarded by the new P-51s that refused to turn back. The psychological effect was immediate. German pilots who had once hunted bombers at will now found themselves hunted instead. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs could dive faster in short bursts, but the Mustang climbed higher, flew farther, and struck harder. Combat reports told of stunned German aces, who engaged the strange American fighter only to be outmaneuvered, outgunned, and left trailing smoke. One Luftwaffe veteran later captured described his first encounter. "We thought it was a Spitfire at first. Then it didn't leave. It followed us home." That was the nightmare, the Mustang's endurance. No longer did bombers lose their escorts near the Rhine. Now the Mustangs chased the German interceptors all the way back to their bases, strafing runways and hangars as they fled to land. The airfields of France, Belgium, and Western Germany became death traps. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In early 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly one-third of its experienced fighter pilots. The Mustang's arrival had turned every mission into a two-front battle: fight the bombers or survive the escorts. They could rarely do both. American air commanders seized the advantage. General Jimmy Doolittle, recognizing the Mustang's potential, changed the rules. Fighters no longer had to stick to close escort. They were free to roam ahead of bomber streams, seeking and destroying the Luftwaffe wherever it hid. What followed was aerial dominance on a scale never seen before. By March, Mustang groups were diving into dogfights from Berlin to the Alps. Even the feared Me-262 jets, when they appeared later, found it difficult to escape coordinated Mustang attacks near takeoff and landing. The air war that had once seemed unwinnable had shifted almost overnight. Above the smoke and chaos, the Merlin's howl became a symbol of Allied supremacy. And for German pilots, a sound they would come to dread more than the bombs themselves. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's veterans spoke of the new American fighter with a mix of fear and disbelief. It seemed to be everywhere, high above the bomber streams, diving from the sun or lurking near the edges of their own airfields. The P-51 Mustang had become what German pilots called der silbernen Tod, the Silver Death. For years, Luftwaffe aces had flown with confidence, knowing their Bf-109s and FW-190s could outclimb or outturn any escort fighter that dared to cross the border. But the Mustang shattered that certainty. Reports from squadrons near Münster and Hanover described unseen shadows escorting bombers to their targets and then pursuing the interceptors as they withdrew. Radio chatter filled with panic as formations broke apart. One pilot, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Hellenbrand, recorded in his logbook after barely escaping an engagement. "They stayed with us from 30,000 feet to the trees. We could not shake them. It was like fighting ghosts." The Mustang's range, over 1,000 miles with drop tanks, meant that no German city, no industrial plant, no airfield was beyond reach. The American strategy was ruthless but precise: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. By May, P-51s were attacking aircraft on runways, fuel depots, and even trains carrying aviation fuel. Germany's skies, once the realm of its proud fighter force, had turned hostile. The nightmare wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The same pilots who once boasted of dominance now found themselves exhausted, flying from shattered bases haunted by the endless drone of approaching Mustangs. Even the Me-262 jet, Germany's last technological hope, could rarely take off without a swarm of P-51s waiting above. The contrast was devastating. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as Europe's most advanced air force. By 1944, it was bleeding to death under relentless pursuit from a machine born of rejection. The Merlin-powered Mustang had turned Allied desperation into superiority and German arrogance into fear. Above the ruins of Cologne and Leipzig, the silver fighters circled like hawks, symbols of a shift no one could reverse. The question now wasn't whether the Allies would win the skies, it was how soon the war below would collapse once they did. While the P-51 streaked across the European skies, its creator watched from far away, surrounded not by battle but by blueprints and drafting tables. Edgar Schmued had no need for headlines. His vindication came in the quiet hum of factory lines and the telegrams arriving from England reporting each new success. Every time a pilot returned alive, every time a bomber formation came home intact, his rejected idea was proving itself again. In late 1944, a photograph circulated among engineers at North American Aviation, a group of young American pilots standing proudly in front of their Mustangs, the fuselage marked with the words "Big Beautiful Doll" in bold script. The image reached Schmued's desk and he smiled faintly. To most, it was just another wartime photo. To him, it was a symbol of everything that had almost been lost to hesitation. the victory of stubborn belief over bureaucracy. Those who had once dismissed his vision now spoke of him with reverence. His insistence on pairing the laminar flow airframe with a more powerful, high-altitude engine had changed the course of the air war. Engineers who had argued for safer, simpler designs now studied his notes to understand how he'd predicted the balance so perfectly. Yet Schmued never took credit alone. He often mentioned the British technicians at Hucknall, the Packard engineers in Detroit, and the factory women who riveted wings through sleepless nights. The Mustang, he said, was a machine born of many hands, but among those hands, his were the first to sketch the shape that would define it. When Allied commanders visited North American's plant in early 1945, they found Schmued quietly overseeing new modifications, fuel extensions, range optimizations, post-war test variants. He greeted them politely, then returned to his desk. To him, engineering was never about glory. It was about solving problems others called impossible. The once rejected design had become the backbone of victory. By the time news reached Inglewood that the 8th Air Force now ruled every daylight sky from Normandy to Berlin, Schmued was already sketching ideas for something new: swept wings, jet propulsion, the next horizon of flight. But history would forever remember this triumph. An immigrant engineer who gave America the weapon that turned rejection into dominance and fear into freedom. By 1944, the Mustang's arrival had not only changed combat, it had transformed Allied strategy itself. What began as a desperate need for bomber protection had evolved into a tool of absolute air dominance. The long-range escort role allowed the Allies to strike anywhere within the German heartland. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, and transportation hubs that once operated untouched now burned under relentless daylight raids. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was collapsing faster than it could rebuild. For every pilot trained, 3 were lost in battle. Fuel reserves dwindled. Airfields were reduced to smoldering craters. The P-51's ability to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin meant that German cities no longer enjoyed a moment's peace. Civilians watched the skies filled with contrails stretching for miles, symbols of inevitability. From a tactical perspective, the Mustang gave the U.S. Army Air Forces freedom of maneuver it had never possessed. Fighter sweeps could precede bomber raids by hours, clearing the sky of resistance. American formations operated at will, their routes unbroken by fear of interception. General Karl Spaatz later wrote that the Mustang was the steel door that locked the Luftwaffe inside its own borders. Strategically, it changed the entire trajectory of the war in Europe. With air superiority achieved, the Allies could invade France with confidence that their forces would not be destroyed from above. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, the skies belonged entirely to the Allies. Mustang groups flew patrols over the beaches, intercepting the few German aircraft brave enough to appear. By the end of the year, they were escorting bombers to bomb the heart of Berlin and strafing trains deep in Czechoslovakia. For German civilians, the once invincible Luftwaffe was now a memory, its aircraft hiding under camouflage nets or buried in forests. Hitler's generals admitted privately that the loss of air superiority made defeat only a matter of time. When the war finally ground to its end in 1945, Allied air power was absolute, and at the core of that supremacy was a fighter that had nearly been abandoned. The Mustang was more than a plane. It was proof that innovation, even when dismissed, could change the shape of a global war. Its triumph was both mechanical and moral, a reminder that technology in the right hands could outlast tyranny itself. When the war ended in 1945, the Mustang had already secured its place in military history, not just as the best Allied fighter of World War II, but as a symbol of ingenuity's quiet power. Over 15,000 were built, flown by American, British, and even Free Polish and Australian squadrons. They escorted bombers across continents, patrolled the skies of liberated Europe, and struck deep into enemy supply lines. But the Mustang's true legacy went beyond its victories. It proved that design brilliance wasn't about wealth, status, or origin. It was about vision. Edgar Schmued's concept, born from the mind of a meticulous immigrant engineer, had demonstrated that the perfect balance of aerodynamics and power could rewrite the rules of warfare. For pilots, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a partner. Many described it as an aircraft that thought with you, agile yet stable, deadly yet forgiving. Major George Preddy, one of America's top aces, said flying the P-51 felt like wearing wings. Others remembered its sound, the throaty rumble of the Merlin engine, as the sound of hope in the sky. That sound would echo far beyond Europe. After the war, Mustangs served in Korea, Israel, and dozens of post-war air forces around the world. Even as jet aircraft emerged, the P-51's silhouette remained a standard of elegance and performance. Aviation schools studied its laminar flow wing, its radiator design, and the way it balanced endurance with lethality. Engineers traced its lineage in every long-range fighter that followed, from the F-86 Sabre to modern interceptors. It wasn't just a relic of history. It was a blueprint for the future. In museums and airshows today, the Mustang's polished aluminum still catches the light, like it did over the skies of Berlin. Veterans who once flew them stand quietly beside the restored planes, touching the cold metal with reverence. For them, it's not nostalgia, it's memory. They remember how a single idea, once ridiculed and rejected, gave them a fighting chance. The Mustang story endures not only because it won a war, but because it proved something timeless, that brilliance often begins with defiance. The war was over, but the echo of the Mustang's engine lingered across the ruins of Europe. In the quiet that followed surrender, airfields once filled with fire and smoke lay silent under drifting clouds. Amid wrecked hangars and abandoned Messerschmitts, a few P-51s still stood guard, their metal skins streaked with oil and victory. The same machines that had torn through enemy skies now rested on calm soil, symbols of both devastation and deliverance. For those who had built them, the silence carried meaning. Edgar Schmued, standing once more at North American Aviation, walked the assembly lines where thousands of Mustangs had been born. The war had demanded speed, ruthlessness, and invention. Now it asked for reflection. The rejected engine concept, the idea that once faced laughter and resistance, had proven how the smallest act of persistence can alter history's course. The Mustang wasn't the work of one nation, one genius, or one moment. It was the product of faith in collaboration. American manufacturing, British engineering, and human determination had merged into a single form of mechanical grace. In its wings lay the story of the 20th century. Technology turned into salvation, ambition welded into purpose. For the pilots who flew them, memory blurred between terror and awe. They had watched the world burn below them, yet from the cockpit of the P-51 they also saw something else. Hope rising through smoke, a belief that freedom could fly farther than fear. As the post-war world shifted into peace and progress, many Mustangs were scrapped or sold for pennies, their combat glory fading into scrapyards and civilian airfields. But some survived, restored and revered, their engines still growling across airshows decades later. When the Merlin starts today, that same deep, confident rumble carries across the crowd, the sound of courage, of invention, of one idea that refused to die. History often remembers generals and battles, but the Mustang reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are forged in silence by minds who simply refuse to give up. In the long echo of that engine, one can still hear the heartbeat of 1943, the moment when a rejected design rose from the ground and changed the fate of a world at war.